Her name was Captain Elena Marquez, though in the barracks she was rarely called anything more than Marquez. The clipped syllables carried across parade fields and training yards, stripped of softness, reduced to the weight of command and discipline. Yet behind that surname was a woman whose life had been shaped by the quiet tenacity she carried long before a uniform stitched her identity. She grew up in a small desert town where the wind curled dust across the roads, where nights were filled with silence broken only by the distant whistle of a freight train. Her childhood had been humble, but it had carved into her the stubbornness to rise even when the ground gave way beneath her feet. The Marine Corps had not been her dream so much as her calling, a path that revealed itself when she was old enough to see the limits of what her town could offer. At 17, she stood in front of a faded recruiting poster in the local grocery store, the edges curling as if even the paper knew the harshness of the sun. The promise wasn't glory. It was belonging. And so she chose it. Not because anyone told her she couldn't, though many did, but because a voice inside whispered she must. Boot camp, for her, was not the forging of discipline so much as the unveiling of grit. She remembered the gravel under her boots, the sting of sweat rolling into her eyes during endless drills, the bark of voices reminding her she was too small, too soft, not cut for this. She bore those words quietly, the way one carries a stone in the pocket, irritating, always pressing, but never enough to break. At night, in the rare stillness of the barracks, she would stare at the ceiling and imagine her mother's kitchen, the smell of warm tortillas, the hum of an old radio in the corner. Those images steadied her when her body screamed to stop. Her presence drew eyes, not only because she was one of the few women in her company, but because she carried herself with a kind of composed defiance. Some mistook it for arrogance, others for fragility waiting to crack. Yet neither was true. She had learned, even then, to wear her silence as armor, her gaze steady, her words few but deliberate. Still, whispers trailed her in every formation. She won't last. She's here because of quotas. She'll fold when it matters. The hardest moments were not the long marches or the sleepless nights. It was the way doubt seemed to stalk her, circling like a predator. She could feel it in the sidelong glances of fellow cadets, in the clipped tones of instructors who never softened their skepticism. And though she told herself those doubts could not touch her, they seeped into her bones like cold. There was one evening, a twilight formation, the air sharp with the scent of pine and dust, when the weight nearly broke her. They had just completed a brutal endurance course, mud caked on their uniforms, every breath burning like fire. She felt the tremor in her hands, the wobble in her legs. And as the line of cadets shuffled into place, someone behind her muttered just loud enough to sting, "She won't make it. She's still just a cadet." The words lodged in her chest, heavier than the pack on her shoulders. She straightened, jaw set, willing herself not to falter. But it was then, as though fate had waited for her weakest moment, that a voice rose from the far side of the formation. Strong. Unwavering. "Stand by, Iron Wolf." The command cut through the dusk, crisp and resolute. She turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the speaker. It was a senior Marine, a man weathered by years of service, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew both the sting of war and the weight of loyalty. The title hung in the air, almost foreign. Iron Wolf. It was not a name she had earned in any official capacity, not yet. But in that moment, it was bestowed with a force that silenced every whisper, every shadow of doubt. Her heart steadied. The tremor in her hands eased. For the first time in weeks, she felt the air fill her lungs not as a burden, but as life itself. That single phrase, simple, unexpected, became a seed planted deep within her. She realized then that resilience is not always forged alone. Sometimes, it requires someone else to see what you cannot yet see in yourself. Later, when she would look back on that evening, she would not remember the mud or the pain. She would remember the silence that followed the Marine's words. She would remember how the stares shifted, from doubt to something else, something bordering on respect. And she would remember the way her own spirit, long battered by quiet wars within, rose to meet the name she had been given. From that night forward, she carried Iron Wolf not as a boast, but as a promise. A promise to herself, and to those who had yet to believe. The months that followed her naming were both a sharpening and a testing. Elena Marquez carried Iron Wolf like a hidden ember in her chest, warming, steadying, but not yet fully aflame. Recognition, after all, did not erase hardship. It simply gave her something to grip when the storm threatened to pull her under. Deployment came sooner than she had imagined. Orders were sealed, packs loaded, and she found herself watching the desert of her childhood replaced by another, harsher desert an ocean away. The air there was different, heavy with heat and dust, the horizon broken not by mountains but by walls, scattered villages, and the ever-present shadow of conflict. She remembered stepping off the transport, boots hitting foreign soil, the sound of rotor blades fading into silence, and feeling the weight of history pressing down. The days blurred into routine. Patrols through streets lined with shuttered windows, the acrid smell of smoke from fires still smoldering, the clatter of gear shifting as they moved in cautious rhythm. She was the only woman in her unit, a fact that seemed to trail her like a second shadow. Some of the men treated her with quiet acceptance, their trust measured in small gestures, a nod when she covered their flank, a brief grin when she kept pace on the march. Others still carried doubt in their eyes, a silent question. Would she hold if the world came crashing down? The hardest moments were not the firefights, though those came with their own terror. The crack of rifles echoing through narrow alleys, the sting of grit kicked up by bullets striking stone too close for comfort. No, the hardest moments were the long silences after, when she cleaned her weapon in the dim glow of a tent lantern, the sounds of laughter and stories from her unit drifting outside. She rarely joined them, not out of distance, but because the weight of expectation pressed too tightly against her chest. She feared that if she laughed too easily, or cried too openly, the whispers would return. There was a night, sharp in her memory, when the ground shook with distant blasts. Her hands trembled as she clutched her rifle, not out of fear but from the exhaustion of endless vigilance. She sat against the cold wall of an abandoned compound, her breath fogging in the chill, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. The radio crackled with static, and for a moment she thought of home, of her mother's voice, soft and worn, asking if she was eating well. The ache in her chest nearly broke her then. Loneliness in war was not just isolation. It was a hollowness that no sound, no brotherhood, could fully fill. The turning point came quietly, without grandeur. It was on a patrol where the streets were unnervingly still, no children playing, no merchants calling. Her gut tightened. That silence was never safe. When the first shot rang out, her body moved before thought could catch it. She pressed forward, shouting commands, her voice steady, cutting through chaos. She covered an alley where movement flickered, the taste of dust on her tongue, the slam of her pulse in her ears. In those frantic minutes, training became instinct, instinct became survival. Afterward, when the silence returned, heavier, weighted with what they had endured, one of the Marines clapped her shoulder. His hand was rough, his face streaked with grime, but his words were simple. Iron Wolf, you kept us alive. The name returned to her like a tether, pulling her from the edge of self-doubt. She realized then that trust was not granted in the barracks or on parade grounds. It was earned in the spaces between fear and action, in the breathless moments where life balanced on the thin line of decision. And she had stood firm. That night, when the unit gathered in a circle of weary bodies and muted voices, she did not sit apart. One of the men nudged space beside him, and without hesitation she joined. They passed around a canteen, shared dry jokes that broke into tired laughter, and in those exchanges she felt something shift. Not acceptance as a concession but as a recognition. She was no longer merely the woman among them. She was one of them. Later, lying beneath a sky heavy with foreign stars, Elena closed her eyes and let the quiet wrap around her. For the first time in months, She did not feel the need to defend her presence. She belonged, not because someone had given her a name, but because she had lived up to it. The struggle was far from over. She knew battles, both within and without, still waited. But beneath the fatigue, beneath the scars beginning to form unseen, there was a steadiness. She was Iron Wolf, and she would endure. The war had a way of measuring time not by days, but by moments that carved themselves into memory. For Elena Marquez, one such moment came in the brittle heat of late afternoon, the sky above their outpost heavy with dust that turned everything the color of rusted copper. She had grown used to the rhythm: patrol, return, eat, clean, rest, but there was always an undercurrent of unease, a knowing that the fragile stillness could shatter without warning. On that particular day, it did. They were escorting a convoy through a narrow stretch of road flanked by crumbling walls and abandoned houses. The silence was unsettling. Not even the distant cries of livestock reached their ears. Elena felt it before she heard it, a tightening in her chest, a sense that the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the blast. The world erupted in fire and dirt. The lead vehicle was struck, flames licking the sky, the shockwave hurling dust into her eyes. Shouts filled the comms, urgent and fractured, and instinct propelled her forward. She dropped into cover, her heart pounding, ears ringing from the explosion. Gunfire cracked from the shadows of ruined buildings, the staccato rhythm like hammers against her skull. She remembered the texture of the ground beneath her palms, rough gravel, warm from the sun, and the acrid smell of burning fuel. She moved with practiced precision, calling out positions, returning fire, her voice carrying over the chaos. But amid the thunder of combat, her gaze caught on something that pierced through the haze: a Marine pinned down, unable to move, bullets sparking against the concrete inches from him. Time seemed to stretch. She didn't think, she moved. Sprinting low across the open stretch, her breath sharp in her throat, she reached him, grabbed his gear, and dragged him into cover. Pain flared across her shoulder where a fragment grazed her, but she gritted her teeth, pressing on. The Marine's eyes met hers, wide, terrified and grateful, before he scrambled back into the fight. It was only when the shooting subsided, when the last echoes of gunfire faded into the hollow silence of the ruins, that the full weight of what had happened pressed down on her. Her hands shook as she reloaded, adrenaline draining into a deep, bone-heavy exhaustion. The men gathered, battered but alive, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. One of them, the same Marine she had pulled to safety, stepped forward. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "You saved my life, Iron Wolf." The name again, spoken not as a title given but as truth earned. Around them, nods passed through the unit, silent affirmations, unspoken respect. In that moment, Elena felt something shift irrevocably. She was no longer the cadet others doubted, no longer the lone woman fighting to prove herself. She was theirs, and they were hers. That night, as they regrouped under a sky scattered with fractured starlight, she sat apart for a moment, letting the stillness seep into her. The desert air was cool now, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and oil. Her shoulder ached where the fragment had cut her, a reminder of how thin the line between life and loss could be. She touched the wound lightly, then let her hand fall, closing her eyes. She thought of home, of her mother's prayers whispered in Spanish over the kitchen table, of the train that once carried her father away for work, of the desert winds that taught her resilience before she ever wore a uniform. And she realized that every step she had taken, every trial endured, had led her here. To this place, this night, this name. Iron Wolf. For the first time, she felt the weight of it not as a burden, but as a calling. The following days brought no respite. Conflict ebbed and surged, and with it came moments that tested the steel of her resolve. Yet through it all, there was a newfound steadiness in her. She had seen what it meant to stand in the breach, to act when hesitation might cost lives. And though fear never left her, no Marine ever truly banished it, she learned to carry it, to let it sharpen rather than dull her. In quiet moments, When the unit gathered and laughter flickered like fragile light against the dark, she found herself speaking more, sharing fragments of her story, listening as others shared theirs. Bonds deepened, not out of obligation but out of the shared truth that survival stitched people together in ways nothing else could. One evening, as they sat in the glow of a dim lantern, a fellow Marine leaned toward her, voice low, almost reverent. "You know," he said, "Iron Wolf isn't just a name. It's who you are to us now." She smiled, faint but certain, and looked around the circle of weary faces. She saw not just comrades but a family forged in fire and silence, in courage and fragility. And in her heart, she carried a quiet vow that she would honor this bond, protect it, and never let it fracture under the weight of doubt again. As the lantern sputtered and the desert night deepened, Elena Marquez sat in the stillness and let the names settle fully into her bones. It was no longer something given. It was something she had become. The war did not end with a single moment of silence or a final battle. It ended in fragments, scattered across days that looked too much like the ones before them. For Elena Marquez, leaving the desert was both a relief and a wound. She remembered the heavy thrum of the aircraft as it carried them away, the desert shrinking beneath its wings. Around her, men spoke in low voices, some laughing too loudly to cover the ache, others staring wordlessly into the void. She sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon until it vanished completely. Coming home was not as she had once imagined. There were banners in airports, the clatter of footsteps on polished floors, strangers offering quick smiles, and "Thank you for your service." Yet behind those words lingered a gap she could not bridge. The sounds were too sharp, the lights too bright. Even the smell of fresh bread from a bakery made her throat tighten, reminding her of smoke curling from burned-out houses. At night, sleep rarely came easily. She would lie awake, the soft whir of the ceiling fan above her echoing the distant hum of helicopters. Some nights, her hand would twitch toward a rifle that was no longer there. Other nights, she found herself listening for the voices of her unit, the camaraderie that had filled the emptiness. The silence of her apartment was deafening. Yet resilience is not always a roaring flame. Sometimes it begins as a fragile spark. For Elena, that spark came one morning when she found her old boots tucked into the corner of her closet. Their soles were worn, the leather cracked, dust still clinging to the seams. She sat on the floor, boots in her lap, and let the memories wash over her. The marches, the dust, the moments when she doubted and the moments when she overcame. Instead of pushing the memories away, she let them settle. They were hers, after all. Painful, yes, but also proof of survival. Slowly, she began to rebuild. She sought out the quiet places in her town, the park where wind rustled through trees, the library where the smell of paper steadied her breath, the church where candles flickered softly against stained glass. In these spaces, she found a kind of healing. She also found purpose in speaking. At first, it was only to small groups, high school students, young recruits just beginning to imagine the weight of the uniform. She told them not of victories or medals, but of the doubt she carried, the loneliness that sometimes threatened to undo her, and the strength she discovered when someone first called her Iron Wolf. Her voice shook the first few times, her hands trembling as they had on the battlefield. But afterward, young faces would approach her, eyes wide with recognition. "I feel that way too," they would whisper. And she realized her story was no longer just hers. It was a bridge for others. One autumn evening, years after she returned, Elena walked along the outskirts of her town. The desert winds curled dust along the road, just as they had when she was a girl. She paused, listening to the sound, a low, steady sigh of the earth itself, and felt a strange peace settle over her. Her body still carried scars, her nights still carried echoes, but her spirit had learned to rest. She thought of the Marines she had served with, of the lives intertwined with hers for those fleeting, harrowing years. Some she still called, their voices a tether across distance. Others lived only in memory. But all of them were part of the tapestry she carried within her. She whispered quietly into the wind, not to anyone in particular, but to all of them at once. We endured. In that moment, she understood what the name Iron Wolf had truly meant. Not invincibility, not fearlessness, but resilience born from struggle, loyalty carved out of sacrifice, and the quiet courage to keep walking when the weight threatened to crush her. As twilight deepened, Elena turned back toward the lights of town. Children's voices floated from a nearby yard, laughter ringing clear against the evening sky. She let the sound wash over her, a reminder that life continued, fragile and beautiful, worth every ounce of what she had given. Today, she no longer fought to prove herself. She stood as a veteran, as a woman who had borne the doubt of others and the weight of war, and who had emerged carrying both scars and strength. Her journey was not about being unbroken, but about learning to rise, again and again, despite the fractures. She carried that truth gently, like a lantern in the dark, not for herself alone, but for anyone still lost in their own silence. Iron Wolf had become more than a name. It had become a legacy of endurance, a reminder that even in the face of doubt and despair, there is always a way forward. And as she walked into the soft night, Elena Marquez carried with her not only the memory of struggle, but the quiet certainty of hope. In the years that followed her service, Elena Marquez discovered that coming home was not a single act, but a lifelong process. Each season brought with it new reckonings, small adjustments to a life that felt familiar and yet entirely changed. She lived in her hometown again, the same desert air brushing against her skin, the same long roads stretching endlessly toward the horizon. But she was no longer the girl who once stared at a recruiting poster and felt a pull toward belonging. She was a woman shaped by fire, silence, and endurance. Mornings were the hardest. The stillness of her small kitchen, the gurgle of the coffee pot, the faint hum of the refrigerator, these sounds were ordinary, yet they pressed against her like weights. She had grown used to the urgency of war, where each sunrise demanded action, each sound carried consequence. Now, the world asked nothing of her but patience, and patience was harder than she ever imagined. She tried to ease herself into civilian rhythms. She volunteered at the local community center, where children gathered after school with dusty shoes and loud voices that filled the halls. They did not know her story fully, only that she had been in the Marines. To them, she was both ordinary and extraordinary, and she accepted that paradox with a small smile. When they asked questions, she answered gently. When they grew restless, she listened more than she spoke. It was in those moments, crouched beside a child struggling with homework or watching a shy girl finally lift her head to read aloud, that Elena felt the embers of purpose glow again. It wasn't the same as carrying a rifle on patrol or hearing her name called in the midst of chaos. It was quieter, subtler, but no less vital. Still, there were shadows. Some nights she woke in a cold sweat, her body jolting as though the ground beneath her had erupted once more. She would sit on the edge of her bed, palms pressed to her eyes, heart hammering until the presence slowly returned. The silence of her room was often more jarring than the roar of battle. On those nights, she rose and stepped outside. The desert night had its own language, the whisper of wind across sand, the distant bark of a stray dog, the soft shimmer of stars. She would walk barefoot across the yard, the earth cool beneath her skin, and let the vastness of the sky hold her. Sometimes, she whispered the names of those who had not come home, her voice almost a prayer. Other times, she said nothing at all, simply breathing, letting the night remind her she was still here. One evening, at the community center, she was invited to speak to a group of young recruits preparing to leave for training. They gathered in a small auditorium, their uniforms crisp, faces alight with eagerness and fear. Elena stood before them, hands clasped loosely, her voice calm but carrying a weight they immediately felt. "I won't tell you it will be easy," she began, her eyes moving from one face to the next. "I won't tell you that doubt won't follow you, because it will. And there will be nights when you wonder if you belong, if you're strong enough. I know because I wondered too. But I will tell you this. Strength is not the absence of fear or pain. It is carrying them and still standing, still moving, still choosing to rise. As she spoke, the room grew silent, every breath caught in the gravity of her words. When she finished, a young man in the front row raised his hand, his voice hesitant. "Ma'am," he said softly, "what kept you going?" Elena paused, the question settling deep. For a moment, memories flickered. The mud, the fear, the sound of a voice once calling her Iron Wolf. She smiled faintly, her chest tightening with both ache and gratitude. "Someone once saw something in me I didn't yet see in myself," she answered. "And when I was ready, I chose to believe it. That's what kept me going. And now," her voice steadied, her gaze firm, "I carry that belief for others. For you." When she stepped down from the stage, several recruits approached her, their eyes wide not with awe, but with recognition. She shook their hands, feeling the trembling in their palms, the unspoken mix of fear and hope. She knew their road would be hard, but she also knew the strength waiting to be uncovered in each of them. That night, walking home beneath a sky brushed with pale moonlight, Elena felt something settle within her. She no longer needed to chase belonging. She had found it, in the voices of the young, in the laughter of children, in the quiet resilience of her own heart. The title, Iron Wolf, was no longer just a name whispered on dusty parade fields or shouted in the heat of battle. It had become a story she carried forward, a story she now shared, piece by piece, with anyone who needed to hear that resilience was possible. And as the wind curled dust across the road, just as it had when she was a child, Elena Marquez walked with steady steps, her heart no longer searching for proof. She was home, and she was whole. The sun fell gently across Elena Marquez's porch, spilling warmth over the worn wood and settling in quiet pools around her boots. She sat in a rocking chair that had once belonged to her grandmother, the creak of its frame a soft rhythm beneath the hum of cicadas. In her hands rested a thin journal, its cover leather-worn, its pages filled with fragments of thought she rarely spoke aloud. Some days, words came like water, flowing steady and sure. Other days, the pen hovered uselessly, silence pressing against her chest. It had been months since she last stood before the young recruits at the community center. Their faces still returned to her in memory, nervous eyes, clenched jaws, the fragile courage of those standing at the edge of transformation. She wondered where they were now, whether they had found their footing or if the long road had already begun to test them. She hoped her words lingered, not as a shield against fear, but as a reminder that fear itself could be carried with dignity. In the stillness of her porch, Elena allowed herself a thought she rarely entertained, what it meant to be a keeper of memory. She carried the voices of those she served with, their laughter and anger, their unfinished stories. She carried the weight of survival, not as a burden alone, but as an inheritance, one she tried to use with care. That afternoon, the quiet was interrupted by a knock on her door. A young woman stood there, barely out of her teens, her posture stiff, but her eyes betraying unease. "Ms. Marquez?" she asked. "Yes," Elena replied, setting the journal aside. I was told you might talk to me about the Marines." Elena gestured gently for her to come inside. The girl sat at the edge of the couch, shoulders drawn tight, hands folded as though bracing against some unseen current. Elena offered her water, but she shook her head. "My brother," the girl began, voice wavering. "He didn't come back. And I thought if I could just understand, maybe it would make sense. Why people go. Why they stay. Why?" Her words broke, her breath shuddering as though it had been held too long. Elena listened, her heart tightening in recognition of the grief that hung between them. She did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, she sat beside the young woman, her presence steady, her voice low. "I can't give you every answer," Elena said softly. "But I can tell you this. Your brother's choice to serve was not about leaving you behind. It was about carrying something larger, even when it cost him more than he should have had to give. And you," she placed a hand gently over the girl's clenched fist, "you are part of that story. His strength is in you now, even if it feels like only absence. The girl's tears came then, falling unchecked. Elena did not move to stop them. She simply stayed, letting the grief unravel, her silence a kind of shelter. When at last the storm eased, the girl looked at her, eyes red but clearer. "Thank you," she whispered. Elena only nodded, knowing gratitude was not owed to her, but to the act of remembering itself. Later, when the house was quiet again, Elena returned to her porch. The desert dusk had deepened, painting the sky in layers of rose and indigo. She thought of the girl, of her brother, of the countless names etched on memorials that stretched across cities and fields. She thought, too, of the living, those who carried on, scarred but unbroken. It struck her then that her life had become less about her own survival and more about being a witness. Not simply to what had passed, but to what still grew in the shadows of loss. Resilience, tenderness, the courage to keep breathing when breath itself felt heavy. As the first stars appeared, Elena opened her journal once more. This time, her hand moved steadily, the words unspooling like threads. "To live is to carry more than one story," she wrote.
Mine.
Theirs. Yours. And in the carrying, we make sure nothing is lost. She paused, looking up at the horizon where the last light clung stubbornly to the earth. Her chest filled with something both fragile and fierce. For the first time in years, Elena felt that her story was not just survival. It was continuation. It was legacy. And as the night settled in, cool and wide, she closed her eyes and let the weight of quiet rest against her without fear.